Hello, fellow Mystery Files. Today I'll be continuing my ranking of all 33 Hercule Poirot novels written by Dame Agatha Christie. This video covers the middle portion of the series with numbers 21 through 11. And despite these books being in the middle of the list, the quality is very high. Poirot has so many wonderful novels that some of them have to be lower on the list than others, but that doesn't mean the low ranking equates to low quality. Fair warning, there may be spoilers ahead, but as always, I will try to keep them to a minimum. At number 21, we're starting off with a novel I always loved, but it suffers from a major issue, and that is Dumb Witness. And the major flaw here is how much repetition there is in this book, where we start off with Emily Arundel and her family with the attempt on her life and her eventual murder, and we just hear this story over and over and over again, with very little new information being added each time we hear it. I like the mystery, especially the use of phosphorus poison, which is unique in the Christie canon, and how some characters mistake the yellow breath for a halo. Emily Arundel is a great character. She is one of a handful of Christie victims who act in their best interest by changing her will. Typically, we have idiot victims who fail to act intelligently. It's really quite humorous when Miss Lawson winds up accidentally inheriting Emily's estate. Other than Miss Arundel, I think the rest of the characters are pretty forgettable. Even Poirot and Hastings don't come off the page in this book like they do in other stories. I couldn't stand these passages told from the point of view of Bob the dog, which I found to be incredibly cringy. I don't know what Christie was trying to achieve with this. Dumb Witness is a strong novel, but in a series of strong novels, it has to land here at number 21. At number 20, I have the very first Poirot novel and Christie's first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And this novel is this high on the list for nostalgia purposes. This is the book that started it all and launched Christie's career. She uses so many twists and Christie staples for the first time in this book. The Mysterious Affair at Styles laid the foundation for pretty much all of her future mystery novels. For the first time, she uses love triangles, people in love pretending to hate each other, poison as a murder weapon, incriminating the guilty party, the double bluff, among many others. The problem for this book is that it's Christie's first book and it suffers from first book jitters. She executes all of these tricks competently. However, she would pull them off much more spectacularly in many future novels. That leaves this book coming across as unremarkable at times. Christie had not perfected her craft here, but was merely laying the foundation, and it is a strong foundation, but it's not perfect. There's also some early installment weirdness with Poirot looking for those physical clues in addition to the psychological clues. In future novels, Poirot would explicitly state he doesn't care about the physical ones. The relationship between Poirot and Hastings is also a little off here, where they don't come across as chummy as they would in future novels and short stories. The Mysterious Affair at Styles is a competent mystery novel, but when Christie has so many more dazzling novels, it has to come here at number 20. Now, for number 19, I have a novel that I think bridges the gap between the good novels with flaws and the good novels I have to nitpick in order to rank them, and that is Dead Man's Folly. And I've always enjoyed this one with Ariadne Oliver's murder hunt gone wrong. Christie uses a switcheroo in this one with Hattie Stubbs not really being Hattie Stubbs, and she goes to great lengths to make this credible. Oftentimes we have an imposter and it's not really credible, but Christie makes it believable here. And there are great clues to play off this, such as Amy Folliot describing two different people when she's talking about Hattie. Christie plays off of people's prejudices in this one, where several characters try to frame Etienne de Souza for the murder, which they can easily pull off because he is black and from the Caribbean. Now, this doesn't really work in today's time because we're just more in tune to these things, but in the 1950s, I can imagine this was an effective ploy. And since Etienne de Souza is innocent, Christie is also dinging her readers for their own prejudices. Poirot and Mrs. Oliver are at their best in this book. Mrs. Oliver, especially, is delightful with her constant knocking of her readers whenever they criticize her books or her murder hunt. This might be my favorite use of Mrs. Oliver in a Christie novel. Now, this book is not without issues. It is at number 19 after all. For me, I think the murder plot was largely unnecessary for the culprits. They kill Marlene Tucker and her grandfather because they know Hattie isn't really Hattie, but their real motivation was because Etienne de Souza is visiting and he wouldn't be fooled by a fake Hattie. But it would just make more sense for them to kill Etienne de Souza instead of going through this rigmarole of murdering Marlene and then having Hattie vanish and then killing Murdell, which also produces a small plot hole because certainly Murdell would have known who killed Marlene. So I think the murder plot does need some work. So I have Dead Man's Folly here at number 19. From this point on, it got really difficult to rank these books. They are all fantastic and classics of the genre. I had to split some hairs going forward, but at number 18, I placed Murder in Mesopotamia. This is a locked room mystery, which Christie didn't write very often, and typically locked room mysteries have really bizarre, outrageous solutions, and this one does not, and it's all for the better. I think the solution is very clever, where the culprit murders the victim by luring her to the window and hitting her over the head from the rooftop. Christie's love for archaeology shines in this book. She is able to describe the dig site, the living quarters, how they operate, and the history of the area with few, carefully chosen words. We're not taken on long, winding journeys through the Middle East for no reason. Christie is focused on the mystery from start to finish. The reason why I put it at the bottom of these top quality Poirot novels is because I think some of the mechanics of the murder are a bit wonky. It's one of those plots where the murderer needed a large number of moving parts to go right in order for them to succeed. That seems unlikely to go correctly, but actually does. I also think some of the characters aren't too memorable here, especially this trio of young male archaeologists who really could have just been condensed into one character. And finally, the fact that Mrs. Liebner didn't realize her current husband is actually her first husband under an assumed identity is a little bit too far-fetched for me to swallow, so I put it Murder in Mesopotamia here at number 18. At number 17, I have a novel I never used to like, but I've recently grown fond of it, and that is The Hollow. And I can see this book climbing up the list with time as I grow fonder of it. The Hollow epitomizes how Christie uses her characters to draw out the mystery. The murder in this book feels so natural as the logical next step in a series of events the characters collectively bring upon themselves. Now, the murder plot is very simple in The Hollow, and that is something I appreciate about it. The murderer is not a very intelligent person, so she develops a pretty simple murder plot that she thinks is ingenious. The murder plot fits the murderer perfectly. I love how Gerda Christo believes she pulled a fast one on everyone, and the only reason why she gets away with it for as long as she does is because everyone else is helping her cover for it, and she's too stupid to realize that and then actively sabotages this. Almost every character in this book is well developed. I particularly like Gudgeon, the butler, who's always covering up Lady Angatel's scattered brain, and Mrs. Crabtree, one of Dr. Christo's patients, who is now facing certain death since Dr. Christo's murder means he cannot develop a treatment for her, and she faces this death with dignity. The reason why I don't have The Hollow higher on the list is for the reason that made me not like this book on my initial read, and that is because there's too many romantic subplots going on. I don't mind the love triangles amongst John and Gerda and Henrietta Savernake, or amongst John, Gerda, and Veronica Cray, because they are relevant to the story, but this romance nonsense between Midge, Edward, and Henrietta takes up way too much time. It has nothing to do with the murder, and I never really cared about it. During these chapters, The Hollow reads like a romance novel where Edward loves Henrietta, but Henrietta loves John. Then Edward falls for Midge, who declines his proposal, and then he tries to gas himself to death in the oven. It was all too sappy for me. I also think Poirot is extraneous in this book. He feels jammed into it and doesn't have any good moments for me, so I place The Hollow here at number 17. Now, for number 16, I have another novel where I feel Poirot doesn't really shine, and that is Appointment with Death. And I wish Poirot was in this book more. I love his challenge to himself that he can solve the murder within 24 hours, which he does complete. It's just that he doesn't come onto the scene until later in the novel, which is fine. It's not a deal breaker, but I do prefer Poirot to be in it from the beginning. The characters in this book are fantastic. The Boynton family is one of my favorite dysfunctional Christie families, and Mrs. Boynton is one of the most tyrannical victims in all of Christendom. The way she controls her family with words and looks sends chills down my spine. Christie expertly uses the psychological aspects of Mrs. Boynton in her murder, where she suddenly allows her family to go off on their own. And why could this be? The only reason Poirot can come up with is that Mrs. Boynton is looking for a new victim to torture, so her killer must be an outsider. Christie also returns to using poison in this book, where Mrs. Boynton is injected with digitoxin, but she also takes digitoxin in her medicine, so it seemed that someone who didn't know that killed her. Christie also uses the power of suggestion here very well, where Lady Westholm is able to just blatantly lie about Mrs. Boynton growling at her when she is already dead, and another character, Miss Pierce, believes this. There's a lot to commend here, especially the setting in Petra, Jordan. Christie really brings it to life, but at times it does slightly feel like a travelogue. With these very minor flaws, I put Appointment with Death here at number 16. At number 15, I have another novel that I wasn't too keen on from my initial read, but I've grown to love over the years, and that is Three Act Tragedy. I could never decide if I find the murder plot in this book to be extraordinarily clever or if it has some holes in it. The murderer in this book wants to kill his best friend, but decides to hide this murder by murdering a guest at his party at random. He poisons a cocktail and places it on a tray for a random guest to drink. To commit a murder for this reason is genius. You can't be targeted if there's no motive, and no one would think a murder was committed at random. The problem I have with this is that the exact right person dies, which seems a little too convenient. The Reverend Babington is an elderly man, so when he drops dead, it's treated as natural causes rather than a murder, which isn't really what the killer was going for. But then again, if one of the other younger people had died, a murder investigation surely would have been launched, and that is really bad for the murderer's ultimate goal. But I think the plot is so genius that I'm willing to forgive this, especially since it worked out perfectly in the end. I think Charles Cartwright and Egglet and Gore are marvelous characters. Lucy Christie had a lot of fun with their hijinks and their love story. I think some of the other characters, like the Dacres and Angela Sutcliffe, aren't too memorable, but they are rendered well enough. Because of the spectacular mystery plot, I put Three Act Tragedy here at number 15. For number 14, I placed a novel I don't see often discussed amongst Christie fans, and that is Mrs. McGinty's Dead. And this one marks the beginning of the later Poirots. It's the first time Mrs. Oliver appears since her initial appearance in Cards on the Table. This is one of the books I recommend to people who ask me which Christie novel they should begin with. It has all of the markings of a good Christie without having the big, shocking revelation. It's just a nice, simple murder. There are two present day murders for Poirot to solve, but the real focus is on four past murders, one of which is important, and Poirot has to figure out which of the four is relevant. I always love these dives into the past, and I think it's coupled nicely with the present day murders. Mrs. Oliver is so much fun in this book, where she really goes off on how horrifying it is for her novels to be adapted, which is an experience Christie shared. She hates Robin Upward, the theater director, adapting her play, and has a lot of great insults and observations about him. There's an attempt on Poirot's life, which we don't see often, and I like how he just brushes it off. He's almost happy it happened because then he knows he's on the right track. Overall, this is another book that has a very strong murder plot, is a delightfully fun read, but it has some forgettable characters, so I placed Mrs. McGinty's Dead here at number 14. In unlucky 13th place, I appropriately have Lord Edgware Dies, which was also published under the title 13 at Dinner. What makes this book so good is Jane Wilkinson. She's a top five one time Christie character for sure, and she may very well be my favorite murderer in a Christie novel. I love how bold and sinister she is. The way she manipulates Poirot into falling into her trap is so good. He does her bidding at every turn. Jane Wilkinson has zero qualms about using other people for her needs. She will kill anyone she has to accomplish her goals. The way she tricks Carlotta into impersonating her to establish an alibi and then just murder her is so cruel and nasty. I love it. Her downfall is also wonderful when Poirot realizes he's been tricked the whole time and he's filled with anger and regret. The final scene is one of my favorite Christie endings, with Jane Wilkinson still trying to profit off of her crimes by hoping her execution will be sensational and she will appear as a wax figure at Madame Tussaud's. The reason why I don't have Lord Edward Dies higher than number 13 is because I think the murder mechanics are a little easy to see through. On my first read of this novel many years ago, I kept thinking it was odd no one considered that the Jane at the party was really Carlotta Adams. It seemed like the obvious solution, but we have Poirot considering that the Jane who announced herself at Lord Edward's house was actually Carlotta and Carlotta killed him, which really didn't make much sense to me. It was a bit frustrating unraveling the mystery almost instantly and then having to spend the entire novel wondering when Poirot will see what I saw. So I have it here at number 13. At number 12, I have another classic Poirot featuring a love triangle, and that is Evil Under the Sun. And this is another classic Christie that I love. The murder plot is extremely clever and well developed, where Arlena's dead body is discovered before she is actually murdered, and this is a very shocking twist. All of the clues are presented to you, but it's very difficult to connect the dots, yet it plays fair. Christie pulls off some very shocking twists across her novels, and this is one of her greatest. The setting is well drawn, where you really feel like you're on the beach with Poirot, and the character work is fantastic. The way Arlena is presented is another great trick. She's depicted as this sultry temptress and gold digger, but in reality, she's none of those things. She's a lonely woman in an unhappy marriage, and very much the victim in more ways than one. The Redferns are delightful villains driven purely by evil and greed, to where Christine Redfern convinces a teenage girl to commit suicide just so the murder investigation can end. I just love brutal Christie killers like these. This book's one flaw is in the murder plot. Even more so than in Murder in Mesopotamia, this book has a lot of moving parts, and the Redferns are extremely lucky to pull this off. Just as a small sample of their luck, they get lucky no one visits the cove where they murder Arlena, especially Horace Black, who is running a drug ring from that location. They get lucky Linda doesn't notice she's gained 45 minutes of time. They get lucky Miss Brewster doesn't see the fake body when she and Patrick discover it. This is especially the case because the Redferns really have to get everything running smoothly and exactly on time. A minute off either way is fatal to them. Now, Christie does go to great lengths to make us believe they could pull this off, and I agree it's not impossible. There's no leap in logic here, so it is forgivable, especially in a mystery novel where the reader should be willing to forego some credibility for the sake of the puzzle. But it's these little things that put Evil Under the Sun here at number 12. And now for number 11, the final novel in this video, I have a book I really wanted to put in the top 10, but I just couldn't squeeze it in there with all that hefty competition, and that is Taken at the Flood. And this is one of the most underrated Christie novels. My favorite era of Christie is in the immediate aftermath of World War II, when Taken at the Flood is set. I love how Christie utilizes the effects of the war in her murder plots. The Claude family has had their lives upturned by the war, and by the death of their patriarch Gordon in an air raid. Gordon married before he died, so his will, leaving everything to his family, has been nullified, and everything goes to Rosaline, his new wife. The Clodes are left with nothing. And their narrative is a very compelling one where they have no idea how they're going to navigate their lives from this point on. Each is facing financial ruin because of economic issues caused by the war, and they cannot get any money out of Rosaline because her brother David is controlling the purse strings. David Hunter is among my favorite Christie killers. I love his devil may care attitude and how he seizes the opportunity before him to swoop in and take this money that's not his. Lynn is another wonderful character. She might be the best version outside of Tuppence of the young, adventurous woman Christie frequently featured in her novels. The fact that David is a murderer and clearly a bad sport from the start doesn't really change her amorous feelings for him. Christie is pulling a lot of strings in this book when it comes to the murder plot. There is a suicide, an accident, and a murder, but it's never clear which is which. She also plays around with convention here, where one would expect Rosaline or David to be the victim, but it's actually a newcomer to Wormsley Vale named Enoch Arden, who is possibly Rosaline's first husband, who has long been thought dead. And when he is murdered, one would assume it is because he is Rosaline's first husband, but Christie plays around with that as well. She's constantly toying with our assumptions and flipping things on us. This book exemplifies all the things Christie does spectacularly. My one criticism of Taken at the Flood is the ending, and it's actually quite problematic, where Raleigh begins struggling Lynn after he confesses to accidentally killing Enoch Arden, and Poirot saves her, but this act of domestic violence makes Lynn fall in love with Raleigh again, and this is not good. I haven't talked about Poirot in this novel, but his portrayal is a bit strange as well. He seems totally fine with Raleigh's actions here, and says that Lynn is safe with him now because Poirot knows Raleigh killed Arden and was responsible for the suicide of Major Porter. And this is something that like Poirot thinks will make Raleigh a good husband. And Poirot does not turn Raleigh over to the police, and that's not really justified either. Poirot has been known to let murderers off free before, but those were under very specific circumstances that don't apply here. It's this criticism that keeps Taken at the Flood out of the top 10 here at number 11. And that is it for today, Mystery Files. My next video will conclude the Poirot rankings with my top 10 novels. If you want to keep up to date with the channel, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment in the comment section. Until next time, Mystery Files.